The year was 2019, and deep within the Pentagon's most classified briefing room, a mission that had stumped America's most elite special forces was about to be handed to someone they never saw coming. Navy SEALs had failed. Delta Force had been turned back. The CIA's best operatives had come up empty-handed. And now, as tension filled the room like thick smoke, all eyes turned to a woman in her 50s who carried herself with quiet confidence, wearing practical field clothes that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern military operation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah McKenna had spent the last 3 decades perfecting what the military establishment considered antiquated methods of intelligence gathering and infiltration. While her colleagues embraced cutting-edge technology, satellite surveillance, and digital warfare, Sarah had dedicated her life to mastering the art of human connection, cultural immersion, and what some dismissively called old-school spycraft. She could speak 7 languages fluently, had lived among indigenous tribes in South America, spent years in remote villages across Southeast Asia, and had an uncanny ability to blend into any environment using nothing more than observation, patience, and genuine human empathy. The mission that had brought everyone to this room was unlike anything the military had encountered before. Deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, in a region so remote that it didn't appear on most maps, a group of American contractors had been taken hostage by a faction that seemed to operate outside all known terrorist organizations. This wasn't your typical extremist group with clear ideological motivations and predictable tactics. These captors were members of an ancient tribal confederation that had remained virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years, speaking a dialect that linguists struggled to classify and following customs that anthropologists could barely comprehend. The initial rescue attempts had been textbook modern military operations. Navy SEALs deployed with night vision, thermal imaging, and precise intelligence about the compound's layout. They approached with surgical precision, using drones for reconnaissance and satellite communications for real-time coordination. The mission should have been a routine extraction, completed within hours. Instead, the SEALs found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move, using terrain knowledge that went back generations and employing defensive tactics that no military manual had ever documented. Delta Force's attempt 2 weeks later had been even more sophisticated. They brought in additional technology, better intelligence, and more firepower. They studied the SEAL mission's failures and adjusted their approach accordingly. Yet somehow, this ancient tribe had outmaneuvered America's most elite warriors once again. It wasn't that they possessed superior weapons or numerical advantages. Rather, they demonstrated an understanding of their environment and an ability to read their enemies that seemed almost supernatural to modern military minds. The CIA's subsequent operation had focused on intelligence gathering and psychological warfare. They attempted to infiltrate the tribe through digital means, intercepted communications, and tried to identify leverage points that could be exploited. But there were no cell phone signals to hack, no internet presence to monitor, and no modern infrastructure to compromise. These people lived as their ancestors had for centuries, and their decision-making processes, social hierarchies, and behavioral patterns remained completely opaque to conventional intelligence methods. As Sarah sat in that briefing room, listening to hardened military professionals describe their failures with barely concealed frustration, she recognized something that everyone else had missed. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with superior firepower or advanced technology. The tribe wasn't defeating American forces through military superiority. They were winning because they understood something fundamental about human nature and territorial defense that modern warfare had forgotten. "The reason your missions are failing," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the testosterone-charged atmosphere of the room, isn't because these people are better fighters or because they have some tactical advantage. You're failing because you're approaching them as if they're just another terrorist cell or military target. But they're not. They're a living, breathing culture that has survived in one of the world's most hostile environments for over a millennium. They don't think like modern people. They don't value what modern people value. And they certainly don't respond to the kind of pressure tactics that work against conventional enemies. The general in charge of the operation, a man whose chest was decorated with ribbons from conflicts around the globe, looked at Sarah with barely concealed skepticism. "Dr. McKenna, with all due respect, we've studied these people extensively. We know their capabilities, their resources, their limitations. What we need is actionable intelligence and a tactical solution, not an anthropology lecture." Sarah smiled, the kind of patient smile that teachers give to students who haven't quite grasped the lesson yet. "General, tell me about their leadership. Structure. Who makes the decisions in this tribe? How do they resolve internal conflicts? What are their spiritual beliefs, and how do those beliefs influence their behavior when they feel threatened? What does honor mean to them? What does shame mean? How do they view outsiders, and under what circumstances have they historically been willing to negotiate rather than fight?" The room fell silent. These were questions that none of the previous missions had bothered to investigate. The military had approached the situation like a puzzle to be solved through force and technology. But Sarah was suggesting that it was actually a conversation waiting to happen between two completely different worldviews. The silence in that Pentagon briefing room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could see the wheels turning in the minds of these career military officers, men and women who had built their reputations on decisive action and overwhelming force. The idea that their failures might stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of their adversary rather than insufficient firepower was clearly a difficult concept to accept. Finally, the general leaned back in his chair and asked the question that would change everything. "Dr. McKenna, what exactly are you proposing?" Sarah had been waiting for this moment for 3 decades. Throughout her career, she had watched as American military and intelligence operations became increasingly dependent on technology, increasingly removed from the human element that had once been the cornerstone of successful intelligence work. She had seen missions fail not because of tactical deficiencies, but because no one had bothered to understand the people they were fighting against or trying to rescue. "I'm proposing," she said, "that we stop treating this as a military operation and start treating it as a cultural exchange. I'm proposing that instead of trying to impose our way of thinking on these people, we learn their way of thinking and work within it. I'm proposing that we send someone who can speak their language, understand their customs, and approach them as equals rather than as targets to be neutralized." The CIA director, who had been silent throughout most of the briefing, leaned forward with interest. "Are you volunteering for this mission, Dr. McKenna?" "I am," Sarah replied without hesitation. "But I need complete autonomy. No backup teams hovering on the horizon. No drones watching from above. No satellite communications or GPS tracking. No extraction plan that relies on helicopter gunships or armored vehicles. If I'm going to have any chance of success, I need to approach these people the way they expect to be approached, as one human being speaking to another, with nothing but respect and genuine intentions." The general's face reddened. "You're asking us to send you into one of the most dangerous regions on Earth with no backup, no support, and no way to communicate with you once you're there. That's not a mission. That's suicide." Sarah had expected this reaction. "General, with all due respect, your high-tech, heavily armed, meticulously planned missions have already failed 3 times. Each time, you've escalated the technology and the firepower, and each time you've failed more spectacularly than before. Maybe it's time to try something different." She stood up and walked to the large map of Afghanistan that dominated one wall of the briefing room. Her finger traced the remote mountain region where the hostages were being held. This tribe has been living in this exact area for over 1,000 years. They've survived invasions by Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and now us. They didn't survive by having better weapons or superior technology. They survived by understanding something that we've forgotten, that every conflict is ultimately about people, and people can only be understood through patience, respect, and genuine human connection. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as military officers debated the feasibility of Sarah's proposal. Some were intrigued by the unconventional approach, while others were clearly horrified by the idea of abandoning everything they knew about modern warfare. But Sarah could see that she had planted a seed of doubt about their current methods, and doubt was often the first step toward genuine change. The CIA director spoke up again. "Dr. McKenna, assuming we approve this mission, what exactly would your approach look like? How would you make contact with these people? How would you convince them to release the hostages?" Sarah returned to her seat, her mind already working through the countless details that would need to be considered. "First, I would need to spend several weeks studying everything we know about this specific tribe, not their military capabilities or their potential weaknesses, but their culture, their history, their beliefs, their language. I would need to understand their social structure, their decision-making processes, and their traditional methods of conflict resolution." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Then, I would approach them the way any visitor would have approached them for the past 1,000 years. I would walk into their territory, alone and unarmed, carrying gifts that demonstrate respect for their culture and their traditions. I would request an audience with their elders, and I would present myself not as a representative of the American military, but as someone seeking to understand and resolve a misunderstanding between two peoples." General shook his head in disbelief. "You're talking about walking into a terrorist stronghold with nothing but good intentions and cultural sensitivity. These people have killed American soldiers, Dr. McKenna. They're not going to welcome you with open arms." "You're right, Sarah. Acknowledged. They have killed American soldiers. But why did they kill them? What were those soldiers doing when they were killed? How did those soldiers approach them? What message did their weapons and their tactics send about American intentions? If we want to understand their actions, we need to understand their perspective." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the intensity that had made her legendary among her colleagues in the intelligence community. These people didn't wake up one morning and decide to take American hostages for fun. Something happened that made them feel threatened, disrespected, or dishonored. Something about our presence in their territory or our actions toward their people violated their understanding of how conflicts should be resolved. If I can figure out what that was, if I can address their underlying concerns rather than just demanding the return of our people, then maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. The debate continued for another hour, with military officers raising practical concerns about communication, safety, and the political ramifications of such an unconventional approach. But Sarah could see that the tide was turning. The repeated failures of conventional methods had created an opening for something different, and her decades of experience in similar situations had given her credibility that couldn't be dismissed. Finally, the general asked the question that would determine whether Sarah's mission would become reality. "Dr. McKenna, what makes you think you can succeed where Navy SEALs and Delta Force have failed? What do you have that they don't?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the villages she had lived in, all the languages she had learned, all the cultures she had immersed herself in over the past 3 decades. "Time," she said simply. "I have time. Your previous missions were designed to be completed quickly, efficiently, with minimal risk to American personnel. But some problems can't be solved quickly. Some relationships can't be built efficiently. Some trust can't be earned without risk. I have the time to do this right, and more importantly, I have the patience to let these people teach me what I need to know to help them solve this problem in their own way. 3 months later, Sarah found herself in a small village on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, the last outpost of modern civilization before entering the territory controlled by the ancient tribe. She had spent those months in intensive preparation, working with linguists to master the obscure dialect, studying anthropological texts about similar tribal structures, and most importantly, learning to think like someone from a completely different world. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Sarah had always been skilled at cultural adaptation, but this mission required her to reach deeper than ever before. She had studied the tribe's oral histories, learned their traditional songs, and even practiced their ancient methods of food preparation and textile creation. She understood that every detail of her appearance and behavior would be scrutinized by people whose survival had depended on reading strangers accurately for over 1,000 years. As she prepared for the final leg of her journey, Sarah reflected on the skepticism she had faced from her own colleagues. Even those who supported her mission had expressed doubts about her methods. The modern intelligence community had become so accustomed to high-tech solutions and rapid results that the idea of spending months in cultural preparation seemed almost quaint. But Sarah knew that this preparation wasn't just helpful, it was essential. The village where she now waited was a fascinating blend of ancient and modern. Solar panels powered LED lights in homes that had been built using construction techniques unchanged for centuries. Satellite phones coexisted with traditional instruments made from animal skins and carved wood. It was a perfect metaphor for the challenge she faced, finding a way to bridge two completely different ways of understanding the world. Her guide for the next phase of the journey was an old man named Hassan, who had been born in the tribal territory, but had left decades earlier to pursue education in the modern world. He now served as an unofficial liaison between his birth culture and the outside world, helping researchers, journalists, and occasionally government officials navigate the complex protocols required for peaceful contact with his people. "Dr. McKenna," Hassan said as they shared tea in his simple home, "I must tell you that many people in my former tribe are very angry about what has happened. The American soldiers who came before you, they did not understand our ways. They brought machines that flew overhead and made terrible noises. They carried weapons that could kill from great distances. They wore clothes that covered their faces, so we could not see their eyes or judge their intentions." Sarah nodded, understanding that Hassan was giving her crucial information about why the previous missions had failed. In a culture that relied heavily on face-to-face communication and personal honor, the high-tech, anonymous approach of modern military operations would have been deeply threatening and disrespectful. "They also came in large groups," Hassan continued, "with many vehicles and much equipment. In our culture, when someone comes to negotiate, they come alone or with very few companions. They come with gifts, not weapons. They come to show respect, not to demonstrate power. Your soldiers, they showed us that they did not trust us and did not respect us. So naturally, we did not trust or respect them in return." This was exactly the kind of insight that Sarah had hoped to gain. The military had interpreted the tribe's defensive reactions as hostility and aggression, when in fact they had been responding to what they perceived as threats and insults according to their own cultural framework. "Hassan," Sarah asked, "what would it mean to your people if someone came alone, without weapons, carrying appropriate gifts, and asking to speak with the elders according to traditional protocols?" The old man smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. "That would mean they were showing proper respect. That would mean they understood our ways and wanted to resolve the problem like civilized people. That would mean they were someone we could trust to speak truthfully and honor any agreement we might reach." Sarah spent the next week with Hassan, learning not just what to do but why each protocol mattered. She learned that the gifts she carried should represent her own culture's finest craftsmanship, demonstrating both respect for the recipients and pride in her own people. She learned that the manner of her approach should follow patterns established over centuries, with specific signals and behaviors that would communicate peaceful intentions from a great distance. Most importantly, she learned about the hostages themselves and why they had been taken. The American contractors had been working on a development project that the tribe believed would destroy sacred sites and disrupt traditional hunting grounds. From the tribe's perspective, they weren't holding hostages. They were detaining people who had come to harm their ancestral homeland without permission or consultation. "This changes everything," Sarah realized as Hassan explained the situation. "The military has been treating this as a terrorist kidnapping, but it's actually a land dispute. These people aren't trying to extract political concessions or make ideological statements. They're trying to protect their home." Hassan nodded gravely. "Yes, but they are also very proud people. They have been insulted by the way your government has responded to their concerns. The attacks by your soldiers have made them feel that Americans see them as enemies rather than as people with legitimate grievances. They cannot simply release the contractors now without losing face, even if they wanted to." Sarah understood the complexity of the situation she was walking into. This wasn't just about negotiating the release of hostages. It was about finding a way for proud people on both sides to resolve their differences without anyone losing honor or dignity. It was about creating a framework for communication between two worldviews that had never been designed to interact. As her departure date approached, Sarah found herself both nervous and excited. This was the kind of challenge she had spent her entire career preparing for, the ultimate test of whether old-fashioned human intelligence could still accomplish things that modern technology could not. She knew that if she failed, it would likely mean the end of her unconventional methods and possibly the end of the hostages' lives as well, but she also knew that she had advantages that the previous missions had lacked. She understood these people not as enemies to be defeated, but as human beings trying to protect something they valued. She approached them not with superior firepower, but with genuine respect for their culture and their concerns. And most importantly, she came to them not with predetermined solutions, but with a willingness to listen and learn. The night before her departure, Hassan offered her a final piece of advice that would prove crucial in the days to come. "Dr. McKenna, when you meet with the elders, remember that they are not just deciding whether to release your people. They are deciding whether Americans can be trusted, whether our ancient ways of resolving conflicts can work with your modern world, and whether there is hope for peace between our peoples. The weight of that decision is something they take very seriously, and it is something you must take seriously as well." As Sarah prepared for sleep that night, she understood that her mission had evolved beyond a simple hostage rescue. She was about to attempt something that could reshape how America approached conflicts with traditional societies around the world. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the margin for error couldn't have been smaller. The journey into the tribal territory began before dawn, with Sarah following ancient paths that had been carved into the mountainside by centuries of footsteps. Hassan had insisted on accompanying her for the first day, partly to ensure she found the correct route, but mostly to provide one final opportunity to refine her understanding of the cultural protocols she would need to follow as they climbed. Higher into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly dramatic and forbidding. Massive rock formations jutted up from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants, and narrow valleys twisted between peaks that seemed to scrape the sky itself. It was easy to understand why this tribe had been able to remain isolated for so long. The terrain alone would discourage all but the most determined visitors. "Dr. McKenna," Hassan said as they paused to rest beside a small stream, "I want you to understand something important about the men you will be meeting. These are not simple mountain people who have been left behind by the modern world. They are the inheritors of a sophisticated civilization that chose isolation over assimilation. Their leaders are highly intelligent, deeply thoughtful individuals who have preserved complex systems of law, philosophy, and governance that are thousands of years old. Sarah nodded, grateful for Hassan's insights. One of the most dangerous mistakes that outsiders made when dealing with traditional societies was assuming that technological simplicity indicated intellectual simplicity. In reality, cultures that had survived in harsh environments for millennia had often developed levels of social sophistication and psychological understanding that modern societies had lost. "Tell me about their decision-making process," Sarah requested as they resumed their climb. "If I'm going to present my case effectively, I need to understand how they evaluate new information and how they reach consensus on important matters." Hassan smiled, clearly pleased by the sophistication of her question. "They use what you might call a council system, but it is more complex than that term suggests. The eldest members of each family clan have voices in the council, but so do certain individuals who have demonstrated wisdom regardless of their age or family status. They also consult with what you might call spiritual advisors, people who are believed to have special connections to the ancestors and the natural world." This was fascinating information that helped Sarah understand why the previous military missions had been so unsuccessful. American military culture emphasized rapid decision-making by clear chains of command, but this tribe used a consensus-building process that could take days or even weeks to complete. Any attempt to pressure them for quick decisions would have been seen as disrespectful and counterproductive. "How do they typically respond to proposals from outsiders?" Sarah asked. "Carefully," Hassan replied. "They will listen to everything you have to say, but they will also watch how you say it. They will observe your body language, your tone of voice, your level of patience, your respect for their customs. They are looking for signs that you understand their values and that you can be trusted to keep any promises you make." As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the environment that indicated they were entering the tribe's territory. The paths became more carefully maintained, with stone markers that seemed to serve as both navigational aids and boundary indicators. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of movement on distant ridges, watchers who were undoubtedly reporting her approach to the tribal leadership. "They know we're here," Hassan confirmed when Sarah mentioned her observations. "They have known since we started climbing this morning. By now, the council has been informed of your arrival, and they are discussing whether to grant you an audience." This raised an important question that Sarah had been considering throughout her preparation. "Hassan, what happens if they decide not to meet with me? What if they simply refuse to acknowledge my presence?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering how to answer diplomatically. "That would be unfortunate," he finally said. "It would mean that they have decided that further communication with Americans is impossible. It would mean that they see no hope for a peaceful resolution to this conflict." Sarah understood the implications. If the tribe refused to meet with her, it would likely mean that the hostages would never be released alive, and that future American operations in the region would face even more determined resistance. The pressure of that possibility weighed heavily on her shoulders as they continued their ascent. As evening approached, Hassan led her to a small cave that had been carved into the mountainside and furnished with simple but comfortable amenities. "This is a traditional way station," he explained. "Travelers have used this place for centuries when journeying through this region. Tonight, you will sleep here, and tomorrow morning, you will continue alone." The reality of her situation hit Sarah as she watched Hassan prepare to leave. In a few hours, she would be completely on her own in one of the most remote and potentially dangerous places on Earth, carrying nothing but her wits, her cultural training, and a backpack full of carefully chosen gifts. If something went wrong, no one would be able to help her. "Hassan," she said as he prepared to depart, "thank you for everything you've taught me. I know this isn't easy for you, being caught between two worlds like this." The old man smiled sadly. "Dr. McKenna, I have spent my entire adult life trying to build bridges between my birth culture and the modern world. Sometimes I succeed, and sometimes I fail. But I have never stopped believing that understanding between peoples is possible, even when it seems impossible. Tomorrow you will carry that hope with you into the most important conversation of your life." Alone in the cave that night, Sarah reviewed everything she had learned about the tribe and their customs. She practiced the formal greetings she would need to use, rehearsed the presentation she planned to make, and double-checked that the gifts she had brought to ensure they would be appropriate for the occasion. But mostly, she tried to calm her mind and prepare herself for the psychological challenge ahead. She knew that the success or failure of her mission would depend not just on what she said, but on who she was in that moment of first contact. The tribal elders would be looking for authenticity, for genuine respect, for evidence that she understood the gravity of the situation and the dignity of all the people involved. Any hint of condescension, impatience, or cultural superiority would doom her efforts before they began. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer that she would be worthy of the trust that so many people had placed in her. The hostages, their families, her colleagues in the intelligence community, and even the tribal elders themselves, all were depending on her ability to find a path forward that honored everyone's needs and concerns. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn came early in the mountains, with thin streams of sunlight cutting through the peaks and casting long shadows across the valley floor. Sarah woke with a clear head and a sense of purpose that surprised her. Despite the magnitude of what lay ahead, she felt more prepared and centered than she had in months. Her morning routine was deliberately simple and meditative. She ate a light breakfast of traditional foods that Hassan had provided, carefully packed her gifts according to the protocol she had learned, and dressed in the modest, practical clothing that would communicate respect for tribal customs without trying to imitate their traditional dress inappropriately. The final stage of her journey would take her deeper into the mountains, following markers that were invisible to untrained eyes, but clear as highway signs to someone who knew what to look for. Sarah had spent weeks learning to read these subtle indicators, the arrangement of stones, the way certain branches had been bent, the patterns of wear on different paths. As she walked, she began to encounter more obvious signs of the tribe's presence. Terraced gardens carved into steep hillsides demonstrated sophisticated agricultural techniques that had been refined over countless generations. Irrigation channels carved into solid rock showed an understanding of water management that would impress modern engineers. This was clearly not a primitive society, but rather one that had chosen to live in harmony with its environment rather than dominating it. Eventually led to a natural amphitheater formed by towering rock walls, with a small village nestled in the center like a jewel in a stone setting. The architecture was unlike anything Sarah had seen before, buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, constructed with such skill that it was difficult to tell where the natural rock ended and human construction began. As she approached the village, Sarah could see people watching her from doorways and windows. Children peered out curiously while adults observed her with the careful attention of people whose survival had always depended on accurately assessing strangers. She maintained the slow, respectful pace that Hassan had taught her, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. According to the protocol she had learned, Sarah should not speak first or approach anyone directly. Instead, she should position herself in a designated area near the village center and wait to be acknowledged by the appropriate authorities. This waiting period could last minutes or hours, and her patience during this time would be interpreted as a sign of her sincerity and respect. She found the traditional waiting spot, a flat stone that had been worn smooth by countless previous visitors, and sat down in the prescribed manner. Then she began the most challenging part of her mission, waiting with dignity and calm, while dozens of eyes evaluated her every movement. The psychological pressure was intense. Sarah could feel the weight of scrutiny from the villagers, and she knew that everything depended on making the right impression during these crucial first hours. She focused on her breathing, on maintaining proper posture, and on projecting an aura of peaceful confidence rather than nervous anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour, an elderly woman approached Sarah with measured steps. She was dressed simply but with evident care, and her bearing suggested significant authority within the community. This would be Sarah's first test, responding appropriately to whoever had been chosen to make initial contact. The woman spoke in the dialect that Sarah had spent months learning, her words formal and precise. "Stranger, you have come far to reach our home. State your name and your purpose, so that our people may know whether you come in peace or with harmful intentions." Sarah rose slowly and performed the traditional greeting that Hassan had taught. Her hands pressed together and a slight bow that showed respect without subservience. "Honored elder, I am Sarah, daughter of teachers, seeker of understanding between peoples. I come with gifts and peaceful intentions, hoping to speak with your wise leaders about concerns that trouble both our peoples." The woman studied Sarah carefully, clearly evaluating not just her words, but her pronunciation, her body language, and her overall demeanor. After a long moment, she nodded slightly. "I am Zara, speaker for the Women's Council. Your words are properly spoken, and your manner shows respect for our customs. The elders have been informed of your presence, and they will decide whether to grant you an audience." This was progress, but Sarah knew she was still in a probationary period. Zara gestured for her to follow, leading her to a simple but comfortable building that served as a guest house for important visitors. The interior was sparsely furnished but beautifully crafted, with intricate weavings and carvings that spoke to centuries of artistic tradition. "You will wait here while the council deliberates," Zara explained. "Food and water will be provided. If you need anything else, you may ask, but understand that your requests will be evaluated as signs of your character and your understanding of our ways." Left alone in the guest house, Sarah had time to reflect on how different this experience was from the high-tech military operations that had preceded her. There were no radios crackling with status updates, no helicopters standing by for rapid extraction, and no satellite surveillance providing real-time intelligence. She was completely dependent on her ability to navigate human relationships and cultural protocols. Hours passed with no word from the council. Sarah used the time to review her presentation one final time, to ensure that her gifts were properly arranged, and to mentally prepare for whatever form the eventual meeting might take. She knew that the length of the deliberation was itself a form of communication. The elders were demonstrating the seriousness with which they approached decisions involving outsiders. As evening approached, Zara returned with a simple meal and important news. "The council has agreed to meet with you tomorrow at sunrise," she announced. "This is a great honor, as they have not granted audience to any American since your soldiers first came to our territory." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. She had cleared the first hurdle, but the real test lay ahead. "Honored Zara, may I ask what I should expect from this meeting? I want to show proper respect and avoid any actions that might give offense." The older woman considered the question carefully. "The council will hear your words, but they will also judge your spirit. They will look for evidence that you understand the pain that has been caused, and that you genuinely seek a path toward healing. They will want to know if Americans can be trusted to honor agreements and to treat our people with dignity." This conversation helped Sarah Understand that she wasn't just negotiating for the release of hostages. She was potentially reshaping the relationship between her country and this ancient culture. The implications of that responsibility were both humbling and inspiring. The night before her meeting with the tribal council was the longest of Sarah's life. She had participated in high-stakes negotiations before, but never with so much riding on her personal ability to bridge two completely different worldviews. As she lay in the comfortable but unfamiliar bed, listening to the mountain wind whistling through the stone corridors, she tried to quiet her mind and focus on the task ahead. She woke before dawn, as was her habit, and spent the early morning hours in meditation and final preparation. Every detail of her appearance and behavior would be scrutinized, so she dressed with care in clothing that was respectful but not presumptuous, professional but not intimidating. The gifts she had brought were arranged according to the protocols Hassan had taught her, each one chosen to represent specific aspects of American culture and values. As the sun began to rise over the mountain peaks, Zara appeared at her door. "It is time," she said simply. "The elders are waiting." The council chamber was a natural cave that had been expanded and refined over centuries, with smooth stone walls decorated with intricate carvings that told the history of the tribe. The space felt ancient and sacred, filled with the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Sarah could sense the weight of tradition in every stone, every shadow, every carefully placed object. The council itself consisted of 12 individuals, men and women of various ages who radiated the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine respect rather than imposed power. They sat in a semicircle with the eldest member, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in these mountains, positioned at the center. Sarah approached the council following the formal protocol she had learned, stopping at the prescribed distance and waiting to be invited forward. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but she understood that this was part of the process, a test of her patience and her understanding of their customs. Finally, the eldest council member spoke. His voice was soft but carried clearly through the chamber. "American woman, you have come far to speak with us. We have heard that your people seek the return of those who came to our land without permission. We have also heard that your soldiers tried to take them by force, bringing violence to our peaceful valley. Why should we listen to words when your actions have spoken so loudly?" This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for throughout her entire career. She took a slow breath and began to speak, using the formal dialect she had spent months mastering. "Honored elders, I come before you with a heavy heart, carrying the shame of my people's mistakes and the hope of finding a better path forward. You speak truly when you say that our actions have been loud and harsh. Our soldiers came with weapons and machines because they knew only one way to solve problems, through force and intimidation. They did not understand your ways, your values, or your legitimate concerns about the strangers who entered your sacred lands." Sarah paused, allowing her words to be absorbed by the council. She could see in their faces that they were listening carefully, evaluating not just her words, but the sincerity behind them. "I am not here to make excuses for their behavior or to ask you to forget the disrespect that was shown. Instead, I come to acknowledge that wrong was done, and to ask if there might be a way for our peoples to speak to each other as equals, with the respect and honor that your ancient wisdom deserves." The council members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by Sarah's approach. Previous American representatives had focused on demands and threats. Sarah was beginning with acknowledgement and humility. The eldest member leaned forward slightly. "You speak words of respect, but words are easy. Your country is powerful and rich, while we are few and live simply. Why should we believe that Americans can truly see us as equals?" Sarah had anticipated this challenge. "Honored elder, I ask you to judge me not by my country's wealth or power, but by my willingness to come here alone, without weapons, following your customs and speaking your language." I have spent months learning your ways because I believe that true respect can only be shown through understanding. I do not come as a representative of American power, but as one human being seeking to understand another." She gestured to the gifts she had brought, each one carefully chosen and prepared. "I bring offerings not because I wish to buy your favor, but because your traditions teach that meaningful conversations begin with the sharing of gifts. Each item represents something valuable from my culture, offered in the spirit of creating connection between our peoples." The presentation of gifts was a crucial moment in the negotiation process. Sarah had brought items that demonstrated American craftsmanship and values: a hand-forged knife made by a master bladesmith in Montana, representing the skill and artistry of American craftspeople; a book of photographs showing the natural beauty of American wilderness areas, demonstrating that Americans also valued the preservation of sacred landscapes; and most importantly, a small piece of turquoise jewelry that had been crafted by Native American artisans, symbolizing America's own indigenous wisdom traditions. Each gift was presented with an explanation of its significance, and Sarah could see that the council members were impressed by the thoughtfulness of her choices. This wasn't the kind of generic diplomatic exchange they might have expected. These were personal, meaningful offerings that showed genuine understanding of their cultural values. After the gift presentation was complete, the eldest council member asked the question that Sarah knew would determine the success or failure of her mission. "American woman, you have shown respect for our customs and spoken words of understanding, but you have not yet addressed the heart of our concern. Your people came to our lands to build things that would destroy places sacred to our ancestors. They came without asking permission, without showing respect, without considering how their actions would affect those who have lived here for countless generations. How can this wrong be made right?" Sarah felt a surge of hope. The elder wasn't rejecting the possibility of negotiation. He was asking for a specific solution to a specific problem. This was exactly the kind of concrete issue that could be addressed through careful diplomacy. "Honored elder, I believe the wrong can be made right through understanding and compromise. The people who were taken are not the ones who made the decisions about the development project. They are workers who were following orders, men with families who love them and worry about their safety. But I also understand that their presence in your territory was seen as a threat to things you hold sacred." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "What if we could find a way to address your concerns about the development project, while also allowing these men to return to their families? What if the American government could be made to understand that your sacred sites must be protected, and that any future projects in this region must be planned with your full participation and consent?" The council chamber fell silent as the elders considered her proposal. Sarah could see them communicating through subtle glances and gestures, engaging in the kind of nonverbal consultation that came from decades of working together. Finally, the eldest member spoke again. "You speak of possibilities, but we have heard promises from Americans before that were later broken. Our experience with your government has taught us to be cautious about trusting words that are not backed by actions. What assurance can you give us that any agreement we might reach would be honored?" This was the crucial moment, and Sarah knew that her answer would determine whether the hostages lived or died. She had to find a way to bridge the gap between two different concepts of trust and accountability, while offering something concrete, enough to convince the council that her promises had substance. Sarah understood that this was the pivotal moment of her entire mission. The question about assurance and trust cut to the heart of why every previous American approach had failed. The tribe had no reason to believe that any promises made by the United States government would be kept, especially given the history of broken treaties and failed commitments that characterized America's relationship with indigenous peoples around the world. "Honored elder," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose, You are right to be cautious about American promises. Your wisdom comes from experience, and that experience has taught you that powerful. Nations often break their commitments when it becomes convenient to do so. She paused, looking each council member in the eye before continuing. But I am not here to make promises on behalf of my government. Instead, I want to propose something different, a way for your people and mine to create accountability that doesn't depend on trusting politicians or bureaucrats who may change their minds when circumstances change. The council members leaned forward with interest. This was clearly not the approach they had expected from an American negotiator. What I propose, Sarah continued, is that we create a formal agreement that is witnessed and monitored by respected neutral parties, perhaps the United Nations, perhaps respected academic institutions, perhaps religious leaders from both our cultures. An agreement that becomes part of the permanent record, that cannot be hidden or ignored when it becomes inconvenient. She could see that this idea was intriguing to the elders, but she knew she needed to be more specific about how such accountability would work in practice. More importantly, Sarah added, I propose that this agreement include provisions for ongoing dialogue between your people and appropriate American representatives. Not just a one-time deal that gets forgotten, but a formal relationship that ensures your voice is heard whenever decisions are made that might affect your territory or your people. The eldest council member stroked his beard thoughtfully. You speak of creating new relationships, but you have not yet addressed the immediate problem. Our people are holding your countrymen not because we wish to harm them, but because their presence in our territory represents a violation of our sovereignty and a threat to our sacred places. How do we resolve this immediate crisis while also building the long-term relationship you describe? Sarah had been anticipating this question throughout her preparation, and she knew that her answer would need to address both the practical and the symbolic aspects of the situation. Honored Elder, I believe the immediate crisis can be resolved through a gesture of good faith from both sides. Your people could release the Americans as a demonstration of your willingness to seek peaceful solutions to conflicts. In return, the American government could immediately halt all development activities in this region and commit to conducting a thorough environmental and cultural impact assessment before any future projects are considered. She paused to let this proposal sink in before continuing with the most crucial part of her suggestion. But more than that, I propose that your people be given formal recognition as the guardians of this territory, with legal authority to approve or reject any proposed development projects. This wouldn't just be a promise that could be broken later. It would be a legal status that could be enforced through international law. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and intense. Council members began speaking among themselves in rapid, excited voices, clearly energized by the possibility that Sarah was describing. For the first time since the crisis began, someone was offering them not just the return of their prisoners, but actual power to protect their homeland in the future. The eldest member raised his hand for silence, and the chamber quickly quieted. American woman, what you propose sounds like what we have always wanted, recognition of our rights and respect for our authority over our ancestral lands. But such recognition would require your government to acknowledge that we are not just primitive tribesmen, but the legitimate rulers of a sovereign territory. Is your government prepared to make such an acknowledgement? This was the question Sarah had been dreading, because it touched on issues of sovereignty and self-determination that went far beyond her authority as a negotiator. She knew that the U.S. government would be extremely reluctant to recognize any group's sovereign authority over territory that was nominally under Afghan jurisdiction. Honored Elder, I cannot speak for my government on matters of such importance, but I can tell you that there are precedents for recognizing indigenous people's special rights to ancestral territories, even when those territories are within the borders of modern nation-states. What I propose is that we work together to find a legal framework that protects your interests while also satisfying the practical concerns of all the governments involved. Sarah could see that her answer was not entirely satisfying to the council, but she pressed on with what she hoped would be a more compelling argument. The key is to focus on practical results rather than symbolic victories. If you have the legal authority to protect your sacred sites and control development in your territory, does it matter what that authority is called? If you have formal mechanisms for ensuring that your voice is heard and your concerns are addressed, does it matter whether those mechanisms are called sovereignty or something else? This pragmatic approach seemed to resonate with several council members, who began nodding thoughtfully. These were people who had survived in a hostile environment for centuries by being adaptable and practical rather than idealistic. The eldest member spoke again, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism that hadn't been there before. Your words suggest possibilities that we had not considered. But before we can discuss such arrangements, we must know that you personally can be trusted to carry our concerns faithfully to your government, and to fight for the agreements we might reach. Sarah understood that this was both a test and an opportunity. The council was asking her to make a personal commitment that went beyond her official role as a negotiator. Honored Elder, I give you my word, not as a representative of the American government, but as a person who has spent her life trying to build understanding between different peoples, that I will carry your concerns faithfully to my superiors and fight with everything I have to ensure that any agreements we reach are honored. More than that, if necessary, I will stake my reputation and my career on keeping the promises we make here. The chamber fell silent as the council members absorbed the weight of her commitment. Sarah knew that she was putting everything on the line, her career, her credibility, her future effectiveness as a negotiator, but she also knew that this was what the situation required. After a long moment of contemplation, the eldest member spoke words that would change everything. American woman, your words carry the ring of truth, and your actions have shown respect for our ways. We are willing to discuss the specific terms of an agreement, but first, we must know that the men we hold will be treated with honor when they return to your people, and that they will speak truthfully about how they were treated during their time with us. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with relief. The council was moving toward agreement, but they were also showing sophisticated understanding of how the resolution of this crisis might be portrayed in American media and political circles. Honored Elder, I can assure you that these men will be debriefed respectfully, and that their accounts of their treatment will be recorded accurately. More than that, I personally will ensure that the American people understand that your people acted with honor and restraint throughout this difficult situation. The negotiation was entering its final phase, but Sarah knew that the most delicate work still lay ahead. Converting this tentative agreement into specific, actionable terms would require all of her skill and experience. The next phase of the negotiation was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her decades of intelligence work. Rather than the rapid-fire exchange of positions and counteroffers that characterized most high-stakes negotiations, the tribal council operated on a completely different timeline, taking hours to discuss each point and ensuring that every member had the opportunity to express their views fully. What struck Sarah most was the sophistication of their decision-making process. These weren't simple people making simple decisions. They were the inheritors of a complex legal and philosophical tradition that had been refined over centuries. Every proposal was examined not just for its immediate practical implications, but for how it would affect future generations, how it aligned with traditional values, and how it might set precedents for future interactions with the outside world. American woman, the eldest council member said after a lengthy internal discussion, we have decided that we are willing to release the men we hold, but only if certain conditions are met. These conditions are not negotiable. They represent the minimum requirements for us to act with honor while also protecting our people's interests. Sarah nodded, understanding that she was about to hear the non-negotiable terms that would determine whether her mission succeeded or failed. First, the elder continued, the American government must formally acknowledge that the development project was begun without proper consultation with the people who have lived on this land for centuries. This acknowledgement must be public and must include an apology for the disrespect that was shown. Sarah made careful notes, knowing that this requirement would be politically challenging for her government, but not impossible to fulfill. Second, all development activities in our territory must cease immediately and permanently. The equipment that has already been brought into our lands must be removed, and the areas that have been disturbed must be restored to their natural condition. This was a more substantial demand, as it would involve significant financial costs and the abandonment of strategic objectives. Sarah knew that her superiors would resist this requirement, but she also understood that it was non-negotiable from the tribe's perspective. Third, our people must be granted formal authority to approve or reject any future projects that might affect our territory. This authority must be legally binding and must be enforced by neutral parties who cannot be influenced by American political pressure. Sarah recognized this as the core of what the tribe was seeking, genuine control over their ancestral homeland, rather than empty promises that could be broken when circumstances changed. Fourth, the American government must establish a formal relationship with our people, including regular consultations on matters that affect our region, and the appointment of a permanent liaison who understands our culture and can speak our language. This requirement showed remarkable sophistication in understanding how bureaucratic systems worked. The tribe recognized that sustainable change required institutional mechanisms, not just personal relationships. Finally, the elder concluded, there must be compensation for the damage that has already been done to our lands and for the suffering that this crisis has caused to our people. This compensation should take the form of resources that will help us preserve our culture and protect our environment for future generations. Sarah absorbed these requirements, understanding that each one represented not just a negotiating position, but a pivotal, fundamental statement about the tribe's values and priorities. They weren't seeking wealth or power in any conventional sense. They were seeking recognition, respect, and the ability to maintain their way of life. Honored elders, Sarah responded carefully, I understand the importance of each requirement you have outlined. Some of these can be agreed to immediately, while others will require extensive discussions with my government. May I suggest that we work together to develop a timeline for implementing these changes, with the understanding that the release of the hostages would occur as soon as the most crucial agreements are finalized? The council members conferred among themselves before the eldest member responded. We are willing to discuss such a timeline, but you must understand that we will not release the men until we have concrete evidence that our requirements will be met. Words and promises are not sufficient. We need signed documents, legal commitments, and verification from neutral parties. Sarah had expected this position, and she was prepared with a proposal that might satisfy both sides' need for security and good faith. Honored elder, what if we were to create a phased implementation plan? The first phase could include the immediate halt of development activities and the public acknowledgement and apology you requested. These actions could be taken within days and would demonstrate American good faith. The hostages could be released when these first phase commitments are fulfilled, with the understanding that failure to complete the subsequent phases would result in permanent exclusion of American personnel from your territory. This proposal clearly intrigued the council members, who began another lengthy internal discussion. Sarah could see that they were carefully weighing the risks and benefits of her suggestion, trying to determine whether it provided sufficient protection for their interests while also allowing for a face-saving resolution that both sides could accept. During this break in the formal proceedings, Zara approached Sarah with tea and a quiet observation that proved crucial to understanding the council's perspective. Dr. McKenna, she said softly, you should know that this decision is about much more than the men you seek to free. Our people see this crisis as a test of whether we can maintain our independence in a world that seems determined to eliminate traditional ways of life. If we simply give in to American pressure, other governments and corporations will see us as weak and will feel free to violate our territory in the future. But if we can establish a precedent of meaningful negotiations and respectful treatment, it may help us survive as a people for generations to come. This insight helped Sarah understand why the negotiations were taking so long and why the council was being so careful about every detail. They weren't just resolving a hostage crisis. They were potentially setting the terms for their people's survival in the modern world. When the council reconvened, the eldest member's words confirmed Zara's analysis. American woman, we have decided to accept your proposal for phased implementation, but with additional safeguards. We want representatives from international organizations to witness and verify each phase of the agreement. We also want your government to deposit a substantial sum of money with a neutral party, to be forfeited if any of the commitments are broken. Sarah realized that the tribe was essentially asking for a performance bond, a financial guarantee that would ensure American compliance with the agreement. It was a remarkably sophisticated approach that showed deep understanding of how to create accountability in international relations. Honored Elder, I believe such safeguards are reasonable and will actually help ensure the success of our agreement by making the commitments concrete and verifiable. However, I will need to communicate with my superiors to determine the specific details of what you are proposing. The eldest member nodded gravely. We understand that you must consult with your leaders, just as we have consulted among ourselves. But we want you to understand that this may be the last opportunity for our peoples to find a peaceful path forward. If this negotiation fails, if your government chooses to use force rather than honoring the agreements we make here, then there will be no more talking. We will defend our homeland with everything we have, and many people on both sides will suffer. The weight of that statement settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Sarah understood that she was witnessing a pivotal moment in history, the point at which two very different civilizations would either find a way to coexist respectfully, or would be locked into a destructive conflict that could last for generations. Communication with Sarah's superiors back in Washington proved to be almost as challenging as the negotiations with the tribal council. Using a satellite phone from a remote mountain peak, she found herself trying to explain complex cultural and political dynamics to military officers and intelligence officials who were accustomed to thinking in terms of force projection and strategic objectives rather than indigenous rights and long-term relationship building. Dr. McKenna, the voice of General Morrison, crackled through the encrypted connection. I need to understand exactly what these people are demanding. Are they asking for money, territory, political recognition? What do they actually want? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine whether her carefully negotiated agreement would be accepted or rejected by her own government. General, they're asking for something that's both simpler and more complex than any of those things. They want recognition that they are the legitimate guardians of their ancestral homeland, and they want the legal authority to protect that homeland from unwanted development or exploitation. That sounds like they're demanding sovereignty over Afghan territory, came the sharp reply. You know we can't agree to that kind of precedent. It would undermine our relationships with allies and create complications in every conflict zone around the world. Sarah had anticipated this objection, and she was prepared with arguments that might persuade her superiors to see the situation differently. General, with respect, I think we're looking at this through the wrong lens. This isn't about sovereignty in any conventional political sense. These people aren't trying to establish a nation-state or join the United Nations. They're trying to preserve a way of life that has existed for over 1,000 years, and they're willing to work within existing legal frameworks to do so. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. What they're asking for is essentially what we've already granted to Native American tribes in the United States, special status that recognizes their cultural rights and gives them authority over certain aspects of land use in their traditional territories. It's not sovereignty in the sense of independence from existing governments. It's more like a form of protected cultural autonomy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for long moments as General Morrison considered her argument. Finally, he responded with the practical question that Sarah had been expecting. Dr. McKenna, even if we accept your interpretation of their demands, how do we know they'll actually release the hostages once we start making concessions? What guarantee do we have that this isn't just an elaborate stalling tactic while they move the prisoners or make other preparations? Sarah understood the general's skepticism, but she also knew that his concerns were based on conventional thinking about hostage situations that didn't apply to this unique cultural context. General, these people aren't terrorists or criminals operating outside the law. They're members of a traditional society that has its own complex legal and ethical systems. Taking hostages was their way of forcing the conversation that they felt was necessary to protect their homeland. But their ultimate goal isn't to harm those hostages, it's to establish a framework for peaceful coexistence that prevents future conflicts. She continued with growing confidence, drawing on her weeks of cultural study and her face-to-face interactions with the tribal leadership. Their decision-making process is based on consensus and honor. Once they make a commitment, particularly one that's made publicly and witnessed by respected elders, breaking that commitment would bring shame not just on the individual leaders, but on the entire community. In their cultural context, that kind of shame is a more powerful deterrent than any legal or military enforcement mechanism we could devise. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah patiently explaining the cultural dynamics that made this situation so different from conventional hostage crises. She described the sophisticated legal traditions that governed tribal behavior, the importance of honor and reputation in their social system, and the practical advantages of resolving the crisis through negotiation rather than force. Gradually, she could sense that her arguments were beginning to resonate with her superiors. The repeated failures of military solutions had created an opening for alternative approaches, and the potential benefits of a negotiated settlement were becoming increasingly clear. Dr. McKenna, General Morrison finally said, "I'm going to recommend to the Secretary of Defense that we authorize you to proceed with the phased implementation plan you've described. But I need your personal assessment. Do you genuinely believe these people will honor their commitments? And do you believe this approach has a reasonable chance of success?" Sarah thought carefully before answering, knowing that her response would carry enormous weight in the final decision. "General, based on everything I've learned about these people and their culture, I believe they are more likely to honor their commitments than most of the governments and organizations we routinely negotiate with. They have no reason to lie to us, because they have the power to simply refuse to negotiate at all. The fact that they're willing to talk and that they're proposing concrete, verifiable steps toward resolution suggests that they genuinely want to find a peaceful solution." She paused, then added the assessment that would prove to be prophetic. "More than that, I believe this approach offers us something that military solutions never could. The possibility of turning a hostile situation into a cooperative relationship that could serve our interests in the region for decades to come." The authorization came through 6 hours later, along with detailed instructions about the specific commitments the U.S. government was prepared to make. Sarah was given unprecedented authority to finalize the agreement, with the understanding that implementation would begin immediately upon the safe release of the hostages. Returning to the tribal council with this news, Sarah found herself facing a group of leaders who had spent the intervening time in their own intensive deliberations. The eldest member greeted her with words that indicated the tribe had reached its own final decision about how to proceed. American woman, we have discussed your proposals with great care, and we have consulted with the spirits of our ancestors about the path we should choose. We are prepared to move forward with the agreement as you have described it, but first, we want you to meet the men you have come to free. This was a moment Sarah had been both anticipating and dreading. She would finally come face to face with the hostages whose fate had brought her on this extraordinary journey. The American contractors were brought into the council chamber under guard, but Sarah was struck by their appearance. Rather than the haggard, traumatized prisoners she had expected to see, these men looked healthy, well-fed, and remarkably calm given their circumstances. The eldest hostage, a construction foreman named Mike Thompson, stepped forward when Sarah introduced herself. "Dr. McKenna, I don't know how you managed to get here or what kind of deal you've worked out, but I want you to know that these people have treated us with more respect and dignity than I would have expected from any captors." His words confirmed what Sarah had suspected about the tribe's approach to the crisis. They had taken hostages not out of cruelty or hatred, but as a way of forcing a serious conversation about their legitimate concerns. "Mike," Sarah replied, "I'm here because my government has finally realized that this situation requires understanding and negotiation rather than force. We're very close to an agreement that will get you and your colleagues home safely while also addressing the concerns that led to this crisis in the first place." The relief on the hostages' faces was evident, but Sarah could also see that their weeks in captivity had given them insights into their captors that might prove valuable in implementing the final agreement. The final phase of the negotiation took place over 3 days, with representatives from the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and several respected academic institutions serving as witnesses and verifiers. Sarah had never participated in such a complex multilateral agreement, but she found herself impressed by the tribe's sophisticated understanding of international law and diplomatic procedure. The tribal elders had clearly studied examples of other indigenous rights agreements from around the world, and they had crafted their proposals to align with established precedents while also addressing their unique circumstances. This wasn't the work of isolated mountain people. This was the product of a legal tradition that had been adapting to new challenges for centuries. The signing ceremony itself was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. Rather than the sterile conference rooms and formal protocols of conventional diplomacy, the agreement was finalized in the same ancient cave where the negotiations had begun, with traditional rituals and ceremonies that blessed the document and invoked the protection of ancestral spirits. The eldest council member spoke words that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis was resolved. "Today, we make an agreement not just between governments, but between peoples. We choose the path of understanding over the path of conflict, the path of respect over the path of domination. May our children and our children's children remember this day as the beginning of a new way for different peoples to live together in peace." The implementation of the agreement began immediately. Within 24 hours, all development activities in the tribal territory had ceased, and the first shipments of equipment were being removed under the supervision of international observers. The public acknowledgement and apology from the U.S. government was broadcast on international news networks, with statements from the President and Secretary of State recognizing the legitimate rights of indigenous peoples to protect their ancestral lands. Most importantly for the immediate crisis, the hostages were released in a ceremony that honored both American and tribal traditions. The construction workers were given traditional gifts as tokens of respect, and they were invited to participate in a reconciliation ritual that formally ended the Kinko conflict between their people and the tribe. Mike Thompson's words during the release ceremony captured the extraordinary nature of what had been accomplished. 3 months ago, I thought these people were my enemies. Today, I understand that they were simply trying to protect something precious that they thought was under threat. Dr. McKenna didn't just negotiate our freedom. She helped all of us understand each other better. The long-term impact of Sarah's mission extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the hostage crisis. The legal framework that she had helped create became a model for similar agreements around the world, demonstrating that indigenous peoples' rights could be protected within existing international law without creating destabilizing precedents. Special liaison position that had been established as part of the agreement became a permanent diplomatic post, with Sarah herself serving as the first occupant. Her role involved ongoing consultation between the tribe and various government agencies, ensuring that future development projects in the region would be planned with full tribal participation and consent. Perhaps most significantly, the success of the mission led to a fundamental reevaluation of American approaches to conflicts with traditional societies. The Pentagon established a new office dedicated to cultural intelligence and alternative conflict resolution, with Sarah playing a key role in training a new generation of specialists who understood that some problems couldn't be solved with superior firepower or advanced technology. The tribal territory itself became a model of sustainable development and cultural preservation. With their newfound legal authority to control development in their homeland, the tribe established carefully managed ecotourism programs that provided economic benefits while preserving their traditional way of life. International scholars and environmental scientists were invited to study their sophisticated systems of land management and resource conservation. 5 years after the crisis, Sarah returned to the mountain village for an anniversary celebration of the agreement. The changes were remarkable to see. The tribe had used their legal authority and the compensation they had received to establish schools that taught both traditional knowledge and modern skills, ensuring that young people could navigate the contemporary world while remaining connected to their cultural roots. The children who had hidden in doorways during her first visit now ran up to greet her with excited questions about the outside world. The elders who had scrutinized her every word during the negotiations now welcomed her as a trusted friend and advisor. Most importantly, the agreement had proven durable, with both sides honoring their commitments even when political circumstances changed in Washington and Kabul. Dr. McKenna, the eldest council member, said during the anniversary ceremony, "5 years ago, you came to us as a stranger seeking to free your people. Today, you are family, and the agreement we made together has become a bridge between our worlds that grows stronger with each passing year." As Sarah reflected on her extraordinary mission and its lasting impact, she understood that her success had come not from superior negotiating skills or political leverage, but from something much simpler and more profound: the willingness to see her supposed enemies as fellow human beings with legitimate concerns and valuable perspectives. The methods that her colleagues had dismissed as outdated had proven to be timeless principles of human interaction: respect, patience, cultural sensitivity, and the belief that even the most complex conflicts could be resolved through genuine dialogue between people of good faith. The mission that had begun with Navy SEALs and Delta Force had been completed by one woman armed with nothing more than linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and an unshakable belief in the power of human understanding. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and force, Sarah McKenna had demonstrated that sometimes the oldest methods were still the most effective. Her story became required reading at military academies and intelligence training centers, not as an example of tactical innovation, but as a reminder of fundamental truths about human nature that no amount of technological advancement could change. The mission that everyone thought was impossible had been accomplished by someone who understood that the most sophisticated weapon in any conflict is the human capacity for empathy and understanding. The hostages were free, the conflict was resolved, and two very different peoples had found a way to coexist with mutual respect and benefit. Most importantly, A precedent had been established that would influence conflict resolution efforts around the world for generations to come. Sarah McKenna's outdated methods had not only succeeded where modern military tactics had failed, they had created a model for a more peaceful and sustainable approach to international relations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.